This is meant to give a very general overview of the entire product development process and who you'd be working with during your journey. So I'm going to talk, supposed to be an image there, but I'm going to talk a bit about my experience and what I've done before this. So I grew up in Boston, as I said before, went to school at USC and studied computer science with a specialization in game development there. At USC, I started my first company, Systems Games, with a fellow engineer and good friend, Drew Erich. Together, we started a 50-person company to build a real-time strategy game from the ground up, which we actually released on Steam. I think it might be down now, but if it's not down, it's called The Maestros, so if there are any gamers here, pick it up, play it, it's a fun game. After that, I went to go work at a company called Graphic, which was a data visualization company down in Santa Barbara. At Graphic, I led multiple verticals from gaming to home and garden to other consumer product verticals. Graphic was eventually bought by Amazon, and I went to go found my second company, which was Stage.gg. Stage.gg was essentially it was an esports fan experience, bringing all esports information into a single place for people to keep up. I don't know if anybody here is an esports fan, but esports are pretty damn hard to keep up with compared to sports, despite there being hundreds of millions of people who watch it every year. Even I feel like at the time that I started, it was even hard to find when a certain team was playing or when different. Or who were the best players in the league? What were the standings in various leagues, or what the different leagues even were? So we built Stage.gg. Eventually sold it to Mobalytics, where I became the head of product. Mobalytics, another startup. If you can't tell, I love startups. Mobalytics was another startup, and still exists today, where their goal is to help gamers get better at playing games. And Mobalytics essentially did that by getting real-time data about all different players, categorizing their strengths and weaknesses, and then giving them insights and guidance to help them become better. And at Mobalytics, my job was to essentially manage a bunch of different engineering and designer feature teams to build different products on the Mobalytics suite of products. Then after that, I recently left Mobalytics to join a company called Mobalytics, where I'm a senior PM. Also, just small aside, if anybody has questions during any part of the presentation, feel free to raise your hand. Don't be shy. I've put this here, just to make this clear, my views do not reflect the views of my current or prior employers, unless the company was started by me. So with Stage.gg and the Maestros, it does with Graphic, NerdWallet, and Mobalytics. I'm happy to talk about what I can talk about after, but my views on product management do not reflect their views. So why did I make this presentation? I feel like I've actually watched a lot of product school content. I feel like it's definitely helpful to always be supplementing your knowledge with the knowledge of others, especially with a role like product management, which can be vague and differ from company to company. But I wanted to create something that I feel like a lot of people don't focus on, which is just a broad overview of what the product process actually looks like from start to finish. So I'm going to walk through basically what we'll be going through in the presentation. We'll be going through defining the key players who you will work with annually. I'm going to talk through how to align your product goals with business strategy, how to outline a framework to source good ideas from everybody within the organization, and then I'd like to, at that point, share a broad understanding of the entire product process. And disclaimer is that this is not a one-size-fits-all. Like I said, product management varies from company to company, and everybody does it differently, but this is a general framework that I've seen used by a lot of companies. So we'll start with your team. So usually a company where you're a product manager, you have a team that you are a part of. And that team usually consists of a designer, an engineering manager, and engineers. Sometimes you might not have a designer, sometimes you might not have an engineering manager. There could be various reasons for that, like the company's resource strapped, or there's a unique structure of the company, but typically this is a very standard team. And as a product manager, I feel like this is something people get confused about a lot. The product manager is not managing any of these people. At a small organization, they might manage the designer, but in general, the product manager is an individual contributor, and their goal is to manage the product and its success. And then to work with designers, engineers, and the engineering manager to build that successful product. You might also have a project manager on your team. I feel like when teams actually have a project manager or program manager on the team, it's extremely helpful for the product manager, because usually when that person doesn't exist, you're playing the role of the product manager and the project manager, which means that essentially you are helping run the sprints, you are managing the backlog of tasks, you are making sure everybody gets things done on time, you are scoping things for the team, but at the same time you're figuring out, okay, what business case are we trying to solve, what product should we be building. I find that usually when there's not a project manager on the team, that it's a lot harder to actually become an effective product manager. User researcher could also be there. I'd say as a product manager, it's your job to be a good user researcher and to put yourself in the shoes of your users and really understand their pain points. However, at a lot of organizations, you're never really trained on user research. You're never really trained on how to not bias questions and get biased answers. You're probably going to ask leading questions, and it'll give you some signal, but it won't be the best signal. So when a user researcher exists, it's good for the company. And then you could have QA on the team. Generally, like people say in tech companies that there should be one QA for every 4 software engineers. And this does not usually happen, but this is, in my opinion, what an ideal team looks like. And then usually, as a product manager, you will be reporting up to some head of product. Maybe their title won't be head of product, they could be a group product manager, they could be the head of product, they could be a director of product, they could be a VP of product. But generally, their purview and their level of scope of the problem that they're trying to solve encompasses what you're doing and more. And they're typically setting the strategy of a vertical or a set of verticals, and then you're executing on your specific area. So where you are creating specs, they're more seeing if the specs are directionally sound and where the organization should be going.
Destroyer, right?
And then, depending on the size of the company, the head of product could be part of the executive team, they could be reporting to the executive team. But generally, the executive team is what sets the strategy for the company. So I think this part's actually very important. Building a product is not just building what users are asking for or building what people think would be the best additions or improvements to a product. Building a product and then a successful product is about aligning what the executive team is setting as the strategy with the features that you're building. So as an example, if the executive team says, our major strategy right now is to grow our user base, and you're building quality of life features or things that are generally just retaining users that you already have. Even if they're good features, they're probably not what's right for the business at any given time. I feel like this is actually a mistake I see a lot of junior product managers making. And then on top of that, you have to coordinate with almost every other department in the company. As a product manager, your life is meetings for 6 to 8 hours a day, and then working on specs or actually working on work in your alone time after all those meetings. So it's a lot of collaboration. it's a lot of aligning people on what you're trying to build, because you don't actually have authority. You're basically a person in the organization who's trying to get people really, really hyped up about ideas and getting people all going in the same direction. So I think it's important to mention as well, especially since I feel like it might be easy to be misled because of the way product manager interviews are conducted, that your job is not to come up with all the ideas. In fact, your job is not even to come up with the majority of the ideas in the company. I think if you're in your product management interviews, generally they will ask you like there's a product design, there's a typical product design interview loop where they will essentially ask you a prompt, and you have to come up with the problems, all the solutions, and build it basically in 45 minutes. That is not typically what product management is like. It's a lot of careful research. It's a lot of sourcing ideas from the rest of the organization and helping to prioritize what's important and what's not. I think good ideas can come from anybody in the organization, but your primary goal is to make sure your product is successful. And your products, unless you're some stuff on, like, your product's probably not going to be successful if you're the one coming up with all the ideas. The best ideas come from good collaboration between a small set of people. So you, as a product manager, will be measured when your product is successful. So essentially, like, are you aligning your product features with the strategy of the organization, and are you doing that successfully? And like, if it's growth, like, is the product growing? I'm gonna take a step back and talk a bit more about the strategy. I've touched upon this a lot. I have a few slides on this, so we don't have to take a lot of time, but the business in general should have a strategy. If you're working for a business that doesn't have a strategy, you should either speak up or leave that company, because every business should have a very cohesive strategy. Otherwise, everybody's kind of just running around seeing what works. I think this is particularly important if you want to start your own company. It is your job to, at all points, make this strategy extremely clear to people. If you need to say it once a day, if you need to say it once a week, like, make the strategy very clear. Depending on the size of the company, you can have one strategic driver, you can have two strategic drivers, you can have a lot of things that you're trying to do at the same time. But generally, having a focused, like, 1 to 2 strategic driver approach, I feel like is the best framework for a small growing company. That means that when you're building a feature, it's important that, like, you are figuring out how to align those with these different strategic drivers. After you figure out how they align, it's very important to prioritize these features. So a lot of your job as a PM is making trade-offs between building one thing or another thing and prioritizing what's important and what's not. Everybody has ideas of what should be built. The larger your team becomes, the more ideas you're going to have, and you can't build everything at once. It's just not efficient to. Time is very finite, and you're trying to basically extract the most value out of the time you have to build things as possible. So if you're a PM, you have to get very good at prioritizing things, which can seem very abstract. That's why generally having a simple framework to do so can be helpful. So let's say you have features. This is just generally how I like to prioritize things. Different people do it different ways, but I just generally put them into a table. I figure out, okay, what are the strategic drivers that you want to prioritize on? So in this case, it would be MAUs and RPUs, monthly active users, and revenue generated per user. And then estimate the impact that you think this feature will have on that specific metric. And this is like a very overly simplified version of it. Generally, like, this has to be defensible. So if somebody says, okay, why is feature A going to grow monthly active users? So generally, I think that there are multiple avenues that it can come from. One, it can come from user feedback. So if this is a live product and you are trying to figure out, okay, what should be built next, it can come from feedback directly from your users. I think in the case of Mobalytics, Mobalytics and Stage, that was very prevalent, because in the gaming community, people are extremely vocal about what they don't want and don't want. They're not always right about what they want and don't want, but they're very vocal about it. You can also source it from user interviews, so you can go through some ideas or some rough concepts and generate ideas that way. You can do it through analyzing user analytics or data about how people are using your application and come up with ideas from that front. You can do it by analyzing market data and coming up with ideas. Generally, people on your team, when they dog food your products or when they're building things, will just have ideas of what should be built next as well. So what I generally do is try to capture those at the moment where ideas pop up, and try to basically stick this into a big list. Not prioritize it on the spot, but go back at it once a week or once every 2 weeks and reprioritize it for the list. So I think that's generally right. Like, you do want to, I think time to market's very important when you're building anything. But it's also very, very important when you're building features that have a large impact on the business. They talk about it as incremental change versus essentially 10x change, where you want to be working on things that have the potential to grow your business a lot. If you only work on incremental change, your business is not going to grow that much. Likewise, if you only work on big, as we would call venture bets, huge long-term projects that might not pay off, then you also might be shooting yourself in the foot by never actually growing. So it really depends on what the goal is of your team at that given time. So how do you turn those features into a roadmap? I think prioritizing is important, but you're not just popping. Actually, some companies do this. You could theoretically just pop the highest priority thing off of the table, one at a time, and just build that. But there are issues with that. I'm going to talk about those issues. So an issue with that could be you have dependencies which are preventing you from building features that are up higher on the list. And you don't want to wait for those dependencies to get resolved because you don't know. Sometimes managing dependencies can be very difficult. You could also not have the resources necessary to build a specific feature at a given time. And there's a slew of other problems you could run into, but it's important to make sure you have a clear roadmap. With some teams, you can build things, like you said, in parallel. And I think it's a good strategy to figure out what can be parallelized and what essentially has to involve everybody on the team. Generally, you can parallelize in a given sprint, or you can even parallelize on a longer-term basis. So it's important to have a very clear roadmap for a variety of reasons. It's important because, one, it gives your team an idea of where you're actually going, right? So if a very common scenario you will run into are engineers on your team, designers on your team, anybody on your team, if they're ever lacking any direction at any point, they will tell you about it a lot. What are we building next? I don't know what to be doing. You should always be 10 steps ahead in terms of that. And that's not to say your roadmap can't change or plans can't change, but you should always have an idea of where you're trying to go. You shouldn't be figuring it out last minute for the next sprint. It's also very important for resource management. So if you need additional engineers for a project that's coming up in the future, or you need to unlock some partner deal that business development needs to start talking to early on, or there can be a slew of different reasons why you would need to let people know that you plan to do a feature. It has to be very easily understood in your roadmap, and the roadmap should be available to everybody in the company. And then it can also be important because, generally, your manager, other engineering teams, executives in the organization need visibility on what's going to be built so that they can plan effectively as well. Like I said, you're probably going to have a head of product or a group PM or somebody above you. They're trying to manage multiple products at the same time. You want to make sure you're not building things that conflict. You want to make sure nobody's stepping on each other's toes. It's really important to have a very clear idea at all times of where each team's planning to go. And like I said, your roadmap can change and it will not perfectly match reality. It will never perfectly match reality. If your roadmap always perfectly matches reality, then either you can see the future or you're just not reacting to change well enough. Every day, every week, you should be getting inputs or learning new things, which make you question your original plans of where you're planning to go. And that doesn't mean it should change drastically from day to day, but you shouldn't be able to perfectly predict every single thing you're going to be able to do with certainty to the day in like Q3 if you're in Q1. So this is going to be the last part of the presentation. I'm going to quickly go through the product process. I think this is generally important if you're an engineer already or you've already worked in tech. This should probably be pretty clear, but I have had a lot of people ask me, like, how close are we to getting this developed, or what stage is this in? And I think it's to answer that question, the person who you're speaking to and you both have to have a very clear idea of what your process is and basically what your pipeline is for how ideas get pushed through from the research stage to actually getting built. So generally, I think about the product process as 5 stages. There's research, there's the design phase, there's the spec phase, there's the development phase, and then there's the phase in which you ship and analyze the efficacy of what you have built and shipped. And typically, these happen in a pipeline, so they happen in order. However, multiple steps can happen at the same time in some companies, in some situations. So in some companies, they might actually combine the research and the design phase. In others, they might combine design and spec phase. And then throughout this process, the cost of change will actually increase exponentially. So iterating on an idea in the research phase, when you're just saying, I feel like we should be building this to solve this user problem for XYZ reason, testing, validating that, saying, we weren't right, let's change this, is way less costly in the research phase than it is when you're already developing the thing or when you've already released it. Because essentially every idea has to go through every single step and then go back to the beginning if you want to change something generally. So the important thing to note here is that I think a lot of people, it's strange, like generally the cost of change increases exponentially, but that means that the second you notice that something's wrong, even if it's in the development phase, you should change it. That's not to say that you should continue pushing something through. Just who here knows what the sunk cost fallacy is? Sunk cost fallacy. Generally, a sunk cost is a cost that has been incurred and that therefore cannot be reversed. So an example of a sunk cost that I'm sure everybody has run into is who here has ever been to McDonald's, for example? I'm assuming most people here have been to McDonald's. And has anybody ever ordered too much to eat at a fast food restaurant like McDonald's, right? Like most people have ordered, say you're really hungry or you think you're really hungry, you order 2 burgers, you order 2 fries, like you're really hungry, you're gonna be able to eat it all. And you make it through the first burger and the set of fries and you're not hungry anymore, right? But you just paid money for these 2 burgers and this 2 set of fries. So nothing positive will come from you eating the second burger and the second set of fries. But in your head, you've spent money, and a sunk cost can be like, it can be time, it can be some resource, it can be effort. You spent money, and therefore you don't want to waste money by not eating this burger. Even though this burger is bringing nothing positive to your life, in fact, it's only bringing something negative. And that right there is the sunk cost fallacy, believing that because you've invested resources into something, that you have to keep going in that direction to avoid wasted resources.
Kind of similar to tech debt.
Kind of similar, yes, kind of similar to tech debt. Generally, like, you want to be evaluating every decision from the point at which you are right now and what's best for the future. You shouldn't pay attention to decisions you've made in the past to evaluate, except as lessons learned. So you shouldn't say, oh, well, we should keep going in this direction because that's the direction in which we've been going. You should say we should be going in this direction because it is the best option for us to be using our time for the next week, 2 weeks, however long. So going to go through each phase individually. I think we should have about, I think, 8 minutes left, and then I'll take questions. So we're going to go through these quickly. So what should be happening during the research phase? The research phase is a tricky one because I think it generally, so many people do it differently, but how I'd explain the research phase is you have a bunch of hypotheses, you have a bunch of assumptions, and you're trying to validate that these are true. Because especially if you are a user of the product that you're trying to build, you're going to have a lot of opinions on what you should be building, and a lot of those might not be right. Like I said, the cost of change increases exponentially, so it's better to find out that you're wrong in the research phase than it is to find out after you've built and shipped something and nobody wants to use it. So how do you do that? You hypothesize and then validate those hypotheses. So the point is to not jump in blind. You could say, let's use some tangible example. Let's say you're working on Google Maps, okay? And you say, Yelp is really popular. We have data about every single restaurant in the world, and we have ratings for every single restaurant. We should be building some searchable page on Google Maps where somebody can find restaurants near them and then choose them. Could theoretically be a good idea. It might not be a good idea. If you're really excited about it and your team's really excited about it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. You should be backing that up with qualitative and quantitative facts. So you should be consolidating feedback from what you've actually received from the users already. You should be analyzing user data. You should be analyzing market data. You should be looking at your competitors. You should be running user testing sessions and actually putting wireframes or pros or whatever you have in front of people and then gauging the reactions up front. Like I said, it's better to start tweaking things and find out you're wrong in this phase than later on. After that, in the research phase, you want to document your findings. So your job is to do a lot of the research and maybe work with other people in the organization to do the research. But after you've actually done it, how do you convey to the rest of the team what's going on? How do you convey what you found, and how do other people know what to do with that? Like, you didn't just do a bunch of research so you knew where to go. You did it to help align your team and the rest of your organization around some vision and some strategy moving forward. And generally, the best way to convince people is to have evidence behind your decisions. So doing a proper write-up after is really important. Generally, I like to document questions, the answers to questions like what are we building? Why are we building it? Why does it make sense for the company to do right now? Who are we actually building this for? How do we actually plan to build it? What is the desired outcome? Like, say you release it, or how much do you think it will impact the business? In what way will it impact the business? What are you hoping will happen? What are the largest risks for the success of this product in the future? So, like, even if you have everything right, there will always be risks. Like, if you're dependent on some developer API, maybe that developer API changes, or maybe something goes down. Having those mapped out makes it a lot easier to change your strategy moving forward. And are there any dependencies that you need to basically kick off, and then what are key assumptions that we're making? And then after that, let's say you create a design document, everybody on your team agrees, executive team agrees, your manager agrees, then you move forward. Then you say, okay, now it's time to design. Maybe the designer or different engineers were involved in the research phase, but now it's time for you to work with the designer. Some designers like to just do designs on their own, and you just basically give them the document, give them instructions, and then they just do it and you provide feedback. Some designers like to have basically a wireframe that you create. So wireframes are basically like a low fidelity sketches of what you believe the application should look like, different flows, how things should work. And the reason you want to keep it low fidelity early on is so you can iterate upon it as quickly as possible. As a product manager, I'd say it's really important to be able to wireframe and to be able to understand how to user test. Wireframing, like, you can't properly communicate design patterns and design changes just through language. Maybe you can, but I feel like it's a lot easier to be able to draw something out and
So much writing.
yeah, it would be so much writing and understand, like designers are very visual people, so they like seeing visuals. Generally, at that stage, the designer will start creating higher fidelity mock-ups. So maybe they're mid fidelity, maybe they're we could call these mid fidelity, which means that they're not scratch drawings, but they generally like have color and look closer to what the final version of, let's say you're developing a website, closer to what the website will actually look like. After that, it goes to user testing phase. So I generally like to do this. I think other PMs might not. I think it's important to user test your design. So you can do that with in-person interviews. You can do that over Zoom, which is a video chat service. You can do it over a site called User Testing, which will help source users with specific criteria. You can do it with your team by creating your own product. And then after that, after you know, like, this is what we want to build, and we're very sure of it, then you take it on to the polishing stages, and you basically make it as high fidelity as possible so that the engineers can take it and make it into the application. After that, you can do specs in parallel to design. I generally like to. Some people will wait till the end of the design phase. I think it's up to you. Everybody, especially engineers, will love you as a product manager if you create good specifications. If you don't, I feel like I have a controversial view on this. Like, if you don't, I don't think it's the biggest idea biggest deal in the world, because I do think that generally, if you have a small team, you should be having enough conversations about what you're building for everybody to get it and to be able to make their own decisions when they're developing. However, it is always good to have documentation about every decision that you make, what the problems are that you're trying to solve, the different user flows, assumptions that you're making, how it strategically aligns with what the business is doing, and the different user stories that you're trying to complete. If you use a tool like Confluence, then it makes it really easy to then bring it into a project management tool like Jira as well. And then generally you also want to, if there's any QA people in here, you generally want acceptance criteria as well, which is basically just a defined set of when would we know that this is complete and that it's functionally working at a high level so that they can create regression testing. So 2 more phases left. So then we'll go to the development phase. A lot of you here are developers, so this will be simple for a lot of you, but generally a lot of companies in the Bay Area will develop in sprints. Different companies can use waterfall or use a different method, but generally a lot of companies nowadays plan in sprints. And a sprint can be a 1 to 3 week period where you are executing a goal or set of goals as a team. So typically there will be a sprint planning meeting, and in the sprint planning meeting, you already have a prioritized backlog of the different stories and tasks associated with them that you want to be achieving. You're basically taking that from the sprint backlog and moving it in based on what you're strategically trying to do for that given sprint. Once you take that out, basically the team should be estimating the amount of work or the scope of what they're creating and figuring out, like, are we taking on too much or are we taking on too little? From there, you keep aligned every day through daily scrums or daily stand-up. And the stand-up's just like 10 to 15 minutes. Hey, this is what I did yesterday, this is what I will be doing today, and this is what's blocking you right now. The reason why that's important, because I think that a lot of people think it's a waste of time, the reason why that's important is because everybody has visibility on what everybody else is doing and can figure out how to align what they're doing to help unblock other people. So it basically just helps you to be as efficient as possible. Generally, I like to do those in the beginning of the day or the end of the day to not split up. There's a concept for developers where, like, you're essentially always ramping up to your maximum efficiency, and it takes a long time to ramp up. And if you break that, you essentially have to start all over again. So the more meetings you have breaking up that, the less efficient you'll be as an engineer. So I generally like to put that. So I think it's important with stand-ups to mention that as a product manager, one of your key jobs is to be removing any blockers at any given point. If somebody has an issue, like, go help them solve that issue. If somebody needs like marketing to get them some like icons for the latest release, like, go get that from marketing. The biggest person you're trying to unblock is also, or the biggest blocker also might be you. So if engineers have a lot of questions for you, you should be available to answer those questions. The longer people are waiting for you to unblock things, the slower your development's going to become. It's not your job to tell people what to do every day, but it's your job to make sure they have what they need to get the job done. And then you complete stories. You basically, usually there'll be a release schedule, which you'll release different versions upon, and then there'll be a sprint review. Generally, I don't retro every sprint. Some teams do. I just retro when there's a need to retro. So if the sprint went well, probably not anything to retro. If it didn't go well, a retrospective is just generally what could we have improved on and what did we do well. And then let's say you ship a feature or reach a milestone that you're trying to reach. It's great, right? But you're not done because the thing is built and released. Like you're continuously building on a product over time and continuously trying to figure out how to unlock more and more value in that product. So it's really important to be asking questions like, how did we do? What could we improve on? And what did we actually learn from releasing this feature? Remember that design document I told you guys about in the front where you were basically, after the research phase, documenting everything that you found out, all of your assumptions, how much you think it's going to affect the business. This is where you measure against those assumptions and then say, here's what we can do next based on what we've learned. Or if it didn't work, why didn't it work? And if it worked, like, how do we double down and extract more value out of what we've learned? And that's especially where small tests can be really helpful as well.